Okay. Well, Dominic, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak to the wonderful Trollope Society. Again, I feel very honoured to be asked back. Um, I asked Dom what I might usefully talk about, and he gave me some very helpful pointers. So I'm just going to respond as best I can to those by way of introduction. He said that I shouldn't go beyond chapter 14 in terms of the plot. So somebody can perhaps sound an alarm if I start saying something which hasn't happened by chapter 14. I had the privilege of editing The Way We Live Now for Oxford World's Classics, which came out in 2016 or 2015, I think. When was it? 2016. It's quite an undertaking. And the first question that I was asked was just to say something briefly about what it's like to edit this novel. Well, the first thing to say is that Oxford World's Classics are very amenable and helpful as a publishing venue. They do set you a word limit, of course, in the contract, but fortunately they don't take any notice of it. So I was able to provide concisely, at least I hope they're concise, as much apparatus, editorial apparatus, as I felt was appropriate. So the notes really are at that point. I've spotted other things subsequently, but the notes are what seemed to me to be helpful for readers at this stage. It's nice to be able to have a long introduction as well. And if anybody's looked at what I say about the novel, rereading it this morning, I thought it was slightly curmudgeonly, actually. So I thought this tone might have been a little bit more generous, but there we are. I'm arguing against the usual perception of this novel as a great as a great novel about finance, in which Trollope is allegedly ripping apart the corruptions of what the novel views as mid-Victorian capitalism. My argument in the novel and in other articles that I've written about it is that that's a mistake. And in fact, the novel is doing other things. So this is really by way of saying that I think Oxford World's Classics has become a scholarly and serious proposition now. It used to be, of course, simply making the texts available, and often enough with a short introduction or no introduction at all. But I think for historical fiction, that's say fiction from the past, it's now really a very wonderful medium for the proper kind of annotation. It's not textual, of course. It doesn't go into any of the variants or anything of that kind. And I should just pay tribute for a moment to John Sutherland, who I seem to have the rather unfortunate reputation of being the person that takes over editions for Oxford World's Classics that John Sutherland has also done, because I did Orley Farm and Collins the Moonstone, both of which were previously edited by John Sutherland. So on paper, I look as if somehow I'm on his case, trying to erase him from the literary record, which I'm not. As it happens, I don't agree with John Sutherland about this novel, but one of the things that is extraordinarily valuable about what he does is to provide, as you'll know, to provide these remarkable articles about the construction of the novel and its planning, which I'll say a tiny bit about in a moment. I think I've already just mentioned, that sort of PhD Viva question, how would you do it differently if you were starting now? Well, I think the tone could be a little bit more cheery. I also think that I missed the comedy of the novel, which has been particularly revealed to me by listening to Timothy West's astonishing reading of this for Audible. I happened to be at college with Sam West, Timothy's son, and so used just occasionally to meet him in the quad. But it is, I found it's a wonderful reading, but it also so brilliantly brings out the mischievous and sometimes really positively dangerous wit of the novel, which I pick up when I'm hearing it. Let's just turn briefly then to the documentation that we have about how this novel how this novel formed. It's always very interesting, I find, to know what an author's original intentions were. Think of the typescripts of The Wasteland, for instance. Although it's at the same time, it's always quite challenging to know quite what to do with that information, and whether and the extent to which it should or could inform our responses to a text. We certainly know that from the documentation, the memorandum that is preserved in the Bodleian Library, that Trollope's first ideas about the novel that became The Way We Live Now, the Carberry novel, as it's initially glossed as, the initial note sounds as if it was going to be a very different piece from what it turned out to be. We have 5 big character sketches in which there are many things to note, but one of the interesting things is that Roger Carberry is the hero of the novel. And that observation in the memorandum prompts, it seems to me, the thought that I have at any rate, that one of the experiments that Trollope seems to me to be doing in this novel is really to write a novel in which nobody is admirable. How far can a reader, can you or I, go in reading a text where we have no sort of focus for sympathy? It would certainly be easy, wouldn't it, to think that Roger Carberry is the kind of moral centre of the novel. And I suppose on paper, as in the memorandum, that's what he sounded like. But he's not a particularly likable character as Trollope develops him in the novel, rather stern and fierce and morally insensitive. So that's kind of interesting aesthetic proposition about the novel, reading something where we don't directly connect with any of the major characters. The novel, according to the memorandum, is also going to be not about finance, and certainly not about what Trollope later said it was about, which was the commercial profligacy of the age. But in fact, it was going to be, according to these notes, about Carberry's religious doubts. It was going to be, so it looks, as if it was a kind of nemesis of faith book, rather a surprising topic, really, for Trollope. And I guess we see the sort of the memory trace of that only in the, to my mind, rather odd and incongruous figure of the Roman Catholic clergyman who appears after chapter 14. And the novel, it doesn't turn out, I think I can safely say this, doesn't turn out to be a novel about religious doubts of other kinds, for sure, but not a kind of a novel of faith and doubt. Just picking up a couple of other things that interest me about the memorandum. Melmotte is, in the notes, said to live on the south side of Montague Square, M Square. The notes actually say it must be Montague Square. And it seems to me that, as I try to argue in a piece in the Edinburgh companion to Anthony Trollope, that really 39 Montague Square that Trollope has just bought, the builders were probably there sorting out his library and his cellar as he signed the contract for The Way We Live Now. Montague Square and all that it represented of Trollope's financial success in the light of his own feckless and really rather disastrous father and his impoverished upbringing, um, is an important presence, figuratively, of course, signified in verbal terms by Paul Montague's surname. He was originally without the E, as the square is. And I think there's a lot of thinking that one could do about this novel as an affirmation of Trollope's success. He's not as rich as Melmotte articulates himself as being, but he is now successful, and he didn't get it through the kinds of activity, he says obliquely, that Melmotte is accused of. The publication history of the novel, as you'll know, is that it follows Trollope's often used procedure of publishing in parts through, in this case, through the London publishers of Chapman and Hall. It's, as John Sutherland has revealed, it was very, at one level, it was very carefully planned. It's very clear as to what is going to go in each 5-chapter section. But at the same time, it's also clear that what he had planned, he didn't always do at all. And so we can at various points see where he, for instance, loses count of the words. And there are a couple of chapters that end with what we can only call just padding, where you can just see Trollope going, I ended too quickly, and so there's a bit of sort of slightly random material to fill out the chapters. It's very interesting in that respect to see this novel as containing evidence of its own construction. It was then published by Chapman and Hall in two volumes before quite a long time before actually the serialization had ended. That wasn't uncommon, but it must have done the sales very much good of the later installments. And I'm very lucky, thanks to my other half, to have the first edition of the way we live now here, and I won't talk about it as an edition, other than just to say that I don't know if you can see that it is the print is extremely small, so it's quite an undertaking, I think, actually, to read this whole novel in the first edition. Trollope said of the novel, didn't he, in an autobiography, that it was about what I conceive to be the commercial profligacy of the age. That sentence, which I take to task in a 2016 essay for Review of English Studies, which is called "Was the Way We Live Now About the Commercial Profligacy of the Age," in a rather sort of blunt title. I'll just say a couple of things about that. The argument of the essay is that Trollope just doesn't grasp with any seriousness what could be legitimately thought the financial culture of the early 1870s. And he takes on the question of what's illegal in capitalism rather than what is immoral, and that's, you know, it makes for him a much easier target than could be. But it's also rather interesting that statement I sat down to begin in his new house, in the newly furbished writing room of 39 Montague Square. I began to write about what I conceive to be the commercial profligacy of the age. That statement follows a paragraph in which Trollope has been enumerating the success of his own life in terms of material possessions. I own about 5,000 volumes. They are dearer to me even than the horses and the wine in the cellar, upon which I also pride myself. There's a curious there's a curious sort of moment of transition between Trollope saying, look at how successful I am now, as I was then, with this beautiful house in Montague Square and all these things. And then I sit down to write about profligacy. It's an intriguing slippage which invites questions and thought, it seems to me. It's just very fascinating that Trollope doesn't comment on that, the migration of the paragraph from one subject to another. The original reviews were, as they say, mixed. The most interesting ones, to my mind at any rate, take some issue with the fact that this isn't the way we live now. So the most interesting one in this respect would be the Saturday Review, I think, in July 1875, which begins by quarrelling. So the review says, with the incivility of Mr. Trollope's title, the way we live, we will not retort by requesting the author to speak for himself, and so on. So there's an interesting sort of resistance to the notion that the novel is somehow diagnostic, and that plural pronoun embraces everybody and gives us some kind of sense of what, London, is it, or England, or the United Kingdom? We don't know who the we is really. I find that rather thought-provoking, that as a piece of social criticism, if that is what it is, or wants to be, that early penetrating review, Saturday Review, is a bit restless with the claim. And then just to end, just picking up a couple of topics that Dominic just raised, that I thought it might be useful for me to mention. It is a very rewarding novel about involving rumour, the circulation of ideas that we don't know whether they're factual or not. And there's a lot to be said about that. One could have quite a long conversation about that. It sort of belongs to that sort of, in a sense, to the modern moment of the new journalism, which is going to flourish at the end of the 19th century, but it's beginning now, where, as we see in the novel, reports circulate of what people are doing and what they might be like. And some of the figures within the novel are peculiarly surrounded by gossip. It is, in that respect, it's very interestingly sort of domestic novel, because it's about people talking about other people to each other. The word everybody, I noticed, appears 95 times. And it's often in the context of everybody says or everybody thinks, about Melmotte, for instance. It's a novel with a very sharp ear, I think, for chat that is happening out there among the middle classes, mostly, talking about others. And I think one of the interesting things about that is it also asks us to think about what is put into print more generally. Most obviously, what's put into print in the novel, in the terms of the literary reviews that we learn about Lady Carberry, for instance. It's a sort of Balzacian Elysion Perdue, isn't it? In its penetrating satire, really, of the unreliability of what you might read in a journal, and how you might sort of pay for, in one way or another, views to appear. And I find it very interesting as we're reading about that. We sort of invited to reflect on what kind of knowledge it is that we actually get from fiction. What is it that we think we are obtaining of knowledge from a novel? That whole question of whether we might believe what we read is rewardingly self-conscious, I think, in the way we live now. And the last thing I just want to point to, without trespassing beyond chapter 14, is this very remarkable sense of simultaneous action of multiple plots. Um, it gives us something of the buzz and busyness of modernity. We come away with this remarkable sense of different people living different lives at the same time, which Charlotte is very interested in. And I think at the same time, we also have a sense not only of the simultaneity of time, but of, I can't think of a better way of putting this than other than by saying the exchangeability of time. Now, what I mean by that is we can ask ourselves whether we actually quite need to read the chapters in the order that they appear. There's a certain fascinating shuffleableness about the chapters that we could perhaps, like a sort of pack of cards, we could move them around a little bit, and the continuum of particular narrative lines wouldn't be, interestingly, affected. And this isn't going to spoil any kind of dimension of the plot. If I just advert to a later moment in the plot, where one of the characters, Winifred Hurtle, writes a number of letters to the same person. They say very different perspectives on what's just happened, and she writes them, and then she wonders which one she might send. And there's a brilliant sense there, which Claire Pettit has written about. There's a brilliant sense of these documents that could be shuffled, that you could read them in a different sequence, and still they would be a narrative of a kind. It's almost as if Trollope is very alertly commenting on his own fictional practice in this remarkable novel. Thank you.